The Toyota Supra. It's a car that needs no introduction. You know what it is. You've seen it in popular media, from magazines to video games and obviously movies. But my question to you today is, did the Fast and the Furious make the Supra legendary? Or was it already? To give you some background, the Toyota Supra was actually a submodel of the Celica back in the 70s and early 80s. It was the XX and then the Celica Supra, and then finally Toyota decided to make it its own submodel in the form of the Mark II. Now, some people debate on the placement of the marks because some people think that the actual, what we call the Mark V or a 90, the car that's out now, should be called the Mark IV. Some people argue that it's not. For our purposes, the Mark IV is the Supra that we will be talking about today, which is the pride of the 90s. Now, as time moved on, major improvements happened to the car, but they were not without penalty. When the 7M motor came out in the Mark II to Mark III, we unfortunately had some major issues with the head studs not being the right torque spec and thus tarnishing the reputation of the motor and also the car. At this point in time, we're in the mid 80s, going into the 90s and into the early 90s. So Toyota had some cleanup they needed to do if they wanted the Mark IV to be successful. And overseas, the Mark III got the 1JZ. If you're not familiar with that, it's the predecessor and the in-between of the 7M motor that a lot of people are familiar with the older variants of the Supra, and the most famous, the 2JZ. At this point in time, they had converted a lot of the system over to fully fuel injected with all of the technological wonders that they could throw at it, and had partnered with Yamaha in its development. So not only is it on par for Toyota to use another brand to help develop their motor and technology, it's expected at this point. Case in point, BMW working with Toyota on the newest Supra. You guys can have that debate later. We're talking about the A80. Now, with the improvements made to the car, unfortunately we didn't get the 1JZ here in America, so the rest of the world got to enjoy its beautiful splendor, as it was a very boost happy car, capable of making good amounts of power, and the handling in the shell wasn't actually all that bad. In fact, a lot of people praised it across the world in their different auto blogs and auto mags. It had good success, but again, here in America, we didn't get that motor, so we weren't able to see what all the hype was about. We were unfortunately left in the dust on that particular subject. With the arrival of the Mark IV, the Supra now had a declared household name, but it wasn't as revered or well known as some of its competition. You see, at the time, the Supra was kind of angled at your more GT spec supercars and higher end American cars. Cars that were coming out at the time were like Ferraris and Lamborghinis. That's what they were aiming to try and take down. Porsches. They weren't common folk cars. They weren't normalish Japanese cars either that they were competing against. They were squarely going after things like the NSX. And that by itself was a powerfully good car. See, the predecessor to even the Celica Supra was the 2000 GT, which was arguably one of the best, most beautiful, and all around just great cars that Toyota had ever made. It's legendary. The 7M motor that was in the Mark II was the same engine in the 2000 GT, or more or less designed off of it. So there's a lot of heritage at stake coming into the Mark IV. It needs to perform well without any hiccups and do amazing on track and on the road. And to be honest, they did well. When the car was released, it had soaringly good reviews. It handled incredibly on track. It had the safest brakes in the world. The motor, the 2JZ, this newly refreshed and rebuilt design of the 1JZ, was spectacular, making great amounts of power, and eventually even got the famous VVTi, similar to VTEC in Hondas. Everything was in this car's favor. The only problem was the market it was angled for. See, most people today, they would assume that Japanese car fandom is a younger man's crowd, somewhere in the 35 to 18 range. But the car that was built and sold was angled at people who were more successful and a little bit older, somewhere in that 35 to 50 range. The style of driving that it was intended for was more track or GT style and not necessarily just ripping around streets on the open road. So, given the era it was born into, the mid-90s and early thousands, it wasn't a car that people like you and I would be able to buy nor even really be aware of. And yes, my little Frenchie is at my feet chewing on a squeaky toy, so if you hear it squeak, I apologize. See, because of the fact that this car was priced at a relatively higher end price for the 90s, somewhere around the $40,000 range, it wasn't exactly cheap, and it was definitely angled at all the flagship cars in Japan, but also angled at supercars out of Europe. It wasn't a car that was meant for everyday use like the S chassis were. So again, the fan base and the target audience were just in two different places, and thus it didn't get all the support that it obviously has now. And that leads to the early thousands. Here we are, the part that we all wanted to talk about. Did Fast and Furious make the Supra actually famous and not just niche? See, going into the film, Craig Lieberman, the guy who owned the car, even said that his Supra wasn't actually that fast at all. In fact, pretty slow. The final battle, if you will, between it and the Charger at the end of the first Fast and Furious film proved to actually be completely false, because the Charger could have done circles around that car. It was a perfect case of putting the underdog up against the powerhouse of the era, which, if you're not aware, muscle cars were the go-to street cars in the 90s. They weren't Japanese cars, and it hardly was even close when it came to Volkswagens and other British and German cars. It was all about the American muscle cars. My dad, who was in his mid-20s at the time, even stated that when it came to street racing, you didn't see Japanese cars. It was always Chevys with big blocks and Fords with built 5 liters. It was all about that displacement. So when it came to street racing and the technology available for Japanese cars, it just didn't compare. You have to remember that at this point in time, carbureted motors are just now starting to be completely phased out, and now we're moving into fuel injection. But even those carbureted motors are getting fuel injection kits from companies like Holley and Edelbrock. So all the tech is available for American cars, but it's not there for Japanese cars. And because of this disparity, the Supra really wasn't that fast. Now, that isn't to say that there weren't a lot of aftermarket parts for it, but the difference was a lot of the people who were making aftermarket parts were doing so for auto salon, which basically meant make it look good, make it sound good, but not actually make it all that fast. It was more about the show than it was the function, aka form over function. Because of this, the Supra, while it had all these beautiful parts laid out on the ground in several scenes in the movie, didn't actually get much more power out of it. In fact, it really didn't gain much power at all. The stock Supra by itself made somewhere around 320 horsepower to 350, depending on who you ask. So for it to still make that much power, even on a single turbo kit, should tell you how little they gained from the parts they had at the time. Now, that isn't to say there weren't powerful cars in Japan. Of course, we know of the crazy RX-7 based LM car that Mazda had built, making 700 horsepower and revving out to God knows. We know of cars that made crazy amounts of power, but those weren't parts available for people like you and I. They were available for race teams. They were available for people who could afford to spend that kind of money. So when it came to its street culture heritage, what did the Supra have in its favor? So now we move on to the year 2001 to 2002. George Bush is the president of the United States. Y2K fever is over, and everyone on God's green earth knows what a Supra is because the Fast and the Furious made it to the big screen and splashed big time. And so, the market for the Supra became hyperinflated. As always, whenever a car lands on screen and the movie is successful, the value of the car on screen goes up, much like the DeLorean for Back to the Future. Everyone wanted a Supra. It looked incredible, it made great noises, and unless you were just a Toyota head or a fan overseas, they now knew what it was. It wasn't a niche market anymore. Everyone and their children knew what this car was. And people like me, who grew up throughout that era of its rise to fame and popularity, now had something to look forward to in popular media moving forward. Games like Need for Speed and Gran Turismo showcase these cars as great options to take on track and to the street. And thanks to all the riciness of the era, it meant body kits galore, from C West to you name it. They probably made one for that car. It became an overnight sensation that took us all by storm, and a lot of us looking at this car now, 22 years later, are all realizing that this car is an incredibly potentially good car, but it's not out the door. See, now that we're 22 years removed from its last production date, the car is older. It doesn't have that much power, and most of the cars that you and I are familiar with as being fast are already heavily modified. You can look at all these people who bought cars from that era, kept the car from that era moving forward, and built it over time. They now have 700 horsepower or more because people were so desperate to get these cars and make it fast and make it cool like the car they saw on TV, that companies had to respond, because if they didn't, they were missing out on a huge economic opportunity. Brands like Brian Crowler and HKS, they knew they needed to develop fast, go fast bits, because if they didn't, they were going to miss out. And as a result, the Supra has all these parts. This Supra is one of the most notorious names in the car community, both inside and outside the tuner and Japanese car fan base. Even my dad, who is a muscle car guy through and through, barely even knows what a Honda Civic is, knows what a Supra is. So all of this is to stack up to the question, did the Fast and Furious make the Supra popular? And more importantly, make it powerful? In case you hadn't been paying attention, yeah, I'd say so. See, the Fast and Furious movie released right at the precipice of our change from analog to digital. We were watching things on VHS tapes 2 years before the movie came out, and the first DVDs were released not long after. This was the era where everything moved from analog data to digital information. The tech boom was massive, and because the movie came out when it did, people were able to utilize this new and up-and-coming technology to make it better. These were cars that were using only electronic information. They weren't like previous cars that used a very, very rudimentary form of it. These were solely dedicated for electronic data and support. So when you finally have the technology there to do it, why not? See, not only did this movie release at just the right time so that more and more people would see it, it also released at the right time where tech industries could really advance their own technology and invest in new endeavors. Because of that timing and because of everything just lining up perfectly for that movie to be not only successful, but also create a long-lasting heritage within the street scene and car community, and then also the tech industry being right on par with its release, it meant that the Supra's future, at least in its aftermarket career, would be incredibly successful. And I personally think that it was that movie that bolstered it forward so that it would have this stardom that it has. See, there was already a lot of support for cars like GTRs and Evos. Japan had plenty of legendary tuner shops like Garage Defend already building cars and making technology with some of the companies there in Japan. But there wasn't a lot of that here in America. Mostly because the GTR and the Evo weren't legal here. They weren't allowed to be here yet. So when it came to the Supra, the first of the JDM Kings to be here in the United States, it took some sweet time getting to that point where people wanted to know more and, more importantly, take the cars beyond where they already were. Fast and the Furious is the reason why the Supra remains legendary to this day. Thank you all for watching this little expose. I've been wanting to talk about this for a while because I love hypotheticals and I love talking about opinion-based stuff because it gets you and I communicating in that comment section down below, which leads me to say, I want to know what you guys have to say. Do you agree? Do you think that the Fast and Furious is the sole reason why we even know what a Supra is? Or do you think that it would have just eventually come back out around in public knowledge because someone would have found it and figured it out? Let me know. I'm curious. I want to know what you had to say. And as always, thank you guys for watching. Like and sub if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time. God bless and peace.